I'm Adelie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today is a public holiday here in the UK, and so we're releasing a special episode. Firstly, I speak with Sofi Oksanen, who's just published an insightful essay called Same River Twice, Putin's War on Women. The second interview is with Tetiana Tymoshenko, a therapist who works for survivors of sexual violence in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 26th of May, 3 years and 92 days since the full-scale invasion began. Our first interview is with Finnish and Estonian author Sofi Oksanen. And before we dive in, I'd like to give you a little bit of background. She has long described herself as a post-colonial author, drawing a line between the colonial histories of the East and West of Europe. Here's what she says. We know about British colonialism. Russian colonialism, however, is not so well known. She's particularly known for her best-selling novel Purge, published in 2008, which has sold over 1 million copies across the world. Today, all of her books are banned in the Russian Federation and are in violation of its constitution. In March 2023, she gave a speech at the Swedish Academy on the strategic nature of sexual violence in Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its clear genocidal intent. The speech was so well received that she's now expanded her argument in a book-length essay called Same River Twice, Putin's War on Women. It explores how misogyny is at the heart of Russia's state power and an instrument of imperialism. She starts her essay with a family anecdote. What happened to her great-aunt as a young woman during the Soviet occupation of Estonia, in order to show how sexual violence has always been a hallmark of Russian terror. I'd like to read to you the first couple of paragraphs from her book. It's a bit long, but bear with me because I believe it's an important starting point. My great-aunt was not born mute. At the beginning of the second Soviet occupation of Estonia, she, only a child, was taken from her home for a night of interrogations. She never spoke again, at least not in any meaningful way. When she returned home the next morning, she appeared unscathed, but from then on, the only 2 words to leave her lips were, "Yes, please don't." Whatever the question, her answer remained the same. Yes, please don't. She never married, never had children, never dated anyone. She lived out the rest of her days alone with her aging mother. I heard my great-aunt's story when I was a child growing up in Finland, and although the adults spared us the details of the interrogation itself, everyone understood, me included. Sofi Oksanen, thank you very much for joining me. You start your book with the story of your great-aunt. Can you explain to us why you decided to start your essay with this very personal family story?
These long-term consequences of sexual violence is something that I wanted to touch upon as an author, because if you think about TV shows or movies, then actually if they are dealing with the sexual violence, they are actually focusing on the very act of the crime and not actually the long-term consequences. When the large-scale invasion started, it really felt like pushing the replay button, because everything that happened had happened before. Sexual violence, deportations, all those tools Russia is using when it's occupying and colonizing a territory. It's a repetition of the old playbook. I wanted to write an accessible book about Russia's playbook of colonization from the female perspective. War is always very gendered. It's mostly male talk. Women's voice is not included. and it's not included in peace talks. We do know that if we are looking for a just peace or sustainable peace, then women need to be involved. Ever since the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, there's a big story missing from the headlines, and that is the Revolution of Equality. A Revolution of Dignity was also a revolution of gender equality. So many women were involved in the revolution. So many of them went into politics, became active agents in the society. And that is something that has been happening in all Eastern European countries. In a very short period of time, politics had a female face. And this is something that Moscow does not like at all. They don't like this kind of progress at all.
Can you just explain a bit more what the revolution of equality is over the last 10 years and how that makes Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe so distinct and choosing to be distinct from Russia?
When the Soviet Union collapsed, all former Soviet republics, they were pretty much on the same level when you think about gender equality. And yet, just in a very short period of time, female politicians started to pop up in Eastern European countries. Presidents, prime ministers. Now, of course, Kallas has been a very vocal politician in European Union, but all Baltic states have been very, very much more gender equal than politically than they have been during the Soviet Union, which, of course, in its propaganda was telling everybody that it's equal, but in reality, it was not. And the women were not in high positions in the political seats in the Soviet Union. So the change was really enormous and very fast. If you compare this development to Finland, for example, then Finland, which has a very stable gender equality program, gender equality has been in the center of Finland's idea. So in that way, it is remarkable what has happened in Eastern European countries and in Baltic states, but that has not happened in Russia. In Russia, women cannot have a political power.
There's a Russian documentary that you talk about in your book about the women who are part of the protest on Maidan during the revolution and how active they are. And the Russian documentary, the title is The Furies of Maidan. And I think it's very interesting how the dehumanizing language that is applied to Ukrainians as a whole has a very specific connotation when it comes to women, because it's sexualizing them and using that as a tool of dismissal and a tool of dehumanization. Can you explain what that documentary is and what it does?
Yeah, it was a documentary about the Revolution of Dignity, presenting the women involved as sexually ill. Or it was seen that the women who are politically actively sexually disturbed, and they were actually also interviewing Russian doctors who were giving expert diagnosis of the sexualities of these women. And this is actually a very interesting way to discredit, but it's also in line with the old tradition of hysteria. We are going back to the 19th century in a way and seeing women's sexuality as some sort of problem, and also connecting the sexual frustration to political activity. This wasn't only to shame Ukrainians, but it's also a message to Russian women. It's one way of telling Russian women what kind of woman is a good woman, what kind of woman is a sane woman, and to tell Russian women that if you want to be a good Russian woman, then definitely you are not politically active, because then you are simply somehow sexually disturbed.
That's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about what makes a good Russian woman, because you talk about that in the book. And you talk about the very complex history that Russia has with feminism. having given rights to women very early on, earlier than a lot of Western countries. And yet how Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church today dismiss feminism as a Western import. And as you say, a Russian woman should not be involved in politics. That's a way of dehumanizing and dismissing women and their ideas. You also write, it's not equality that makes a woman, but the lack of equality in Russia. So can we talk a little bit about what makes a good Russian woman and what has Putin dismissed from Russia's history when it comes to women's rights and what he has used?
Yeah, Soviet Union was officially equal because Stalin decided that Soviet Union is equal, and that was simply because Stalin got totally fed up with active communist women. Active communist women didn't want to stay at home, but change the world. But of course, after the Second World War, the casualties had been so high. Soviet Union needed soldiers, and therefore women needed to stay at home to give birth. And therefore, Stalin just simply decided that Soviet Union is equal. Of course, in reality, that was not the case at all. And Soviet women had to work as well to be able to provide for their children. And for example, to be able to have a decent flat, you needed to have a certain number of children. So 3 children was quite an average number. Otherwise, you had to live with your parents for the rest of your life. So women didn't really have time to be politically active, to be honest. In 90s, there was the chance to explore all the progressive things that actually had taken place in Soviet Union and Russian Empire as well, because actually beating a wife was illegal. The Russian Empire did have pretty progressive laws when it came to beating your spouse. If we really go into the Russian history, you find a lot of things that would actually tell the women of Russia that it is very much a Russian thing to be a progressive and support equality. But that is not the case in Russian Federation anymore. Putin's regime is about traditional values. It's just an umbrella for inequality.
And what's really baffling in your book, when you talk about rape as a weapon of war and how it's used by the Russian soldiers in Ukraine, is how it's not a dirty secret from the front line. It's completely condoned and enabled and even praised by the home front, by women, wives, mothers at home. Can you tell me some of these stories and what they say about Russia?
One of the most famous ones was the case of Olga Bukovskaya. She is a wife of a Russian soldier. Ukrainians intercepted their phone call, and the wife gave a permission to her husband to rape Ukrainian women as long as he wears protection. And then she was giggling after giving this permission to the husband. And of course, this sounds really weird for most of our listeners. How can a woman encourage your husband to rape other women? But this is a good example of these patriotic gender roles. Actually, what is the result of them? Both Olga Bukovskaya and her husband, they are young people who have been brought up in Putin's Russia. They have been brought up to this value system and these gender roles that have been supported by the government. But what is now remarkable is that actually Olga Bukovskaya was sentenced in absentia for 5 years. And this is really something that, as far as I know, hasn't happened in legal history before, that a woman who is encouraging her husband to rape women is being sentenced. And of course, maybe she'll never go to prison, but at least she's on Interpol's wanted list. And this is a very strong signal, I think, also as a preventive measurement. So even though we are living very dark times, I do see a lot of progress in legal systems. In many ways, I do believe that there are a lot of things concerning sexual violence that is going to really change the way we see it. Times are very dark, but at least this was a positive step forward.
What do you think is going to change in the way we see sexual violence?
We have evidence we haven't ever had before. Of course, we have much more female investigators. We have much more female prosecutors and female judges. This is crucial. If we think about previous conflicts or previous trials where sexual violence has been part of the case, then the number of female investigators, prosecutors, judges, lawyers has been much smaller. We also have new ways to collect evidence. Ukraine is also distributing kits for people so that they are able to collect evidence that is accepted by court. Also, they are giving instructions to people how to, for example, take photos of the crime scenes so that they could be accepted as evidence for court. This is something that hasn't ever happened before. But the question is, what are we going to do with all this evidence? We cannot say we didn't know. No one can say that we didn't know. If we think about previous conflicts, then we could have said that, no, we didn't know. Now we do know. So what are we going to do with all this information? And I think this is something that is going to set a moral compass for Europe. What are we going to do with the information? And how we are going to keep the information safe? Now we know that, for instance, Trump's government is trying to destroy the data related to deported children, which is a very strong sign. Again, they are not respecting evidence about war crimes. What are we going to do about keeping the information safe? What are we going to do about keeping the victims safe, creating a safe space for them? Because Russia is also harassing victims online as well. So there's everything when I'm talking about safety, that requires money. What we do know from the history is that if there is no political will, then there is no justice. And that is why we need to talk about these crimes. We need to keep women's voices involved. And one more thing, which is again something that if you think about the history of sexual violence or history of war rape, then Ukraine's prosecutor's office is having a very high number of cases where a victim is a man. So this doesn't mean that victims of sexual violence hadn't ever been men before. Not at all. But men are not likely to tell about it, or they might be using a different language than women. For example, women might be talking about rape, but men might be talking only about torture, even though rape is involved. So you need to be able to recognize the language, but also the fact that we have so many male victims is also something that we are going to get much more knowledge about sexual crimes when the victim is male.
You talked about the forensic testing kits. In civilian life, in a lot of countries across the West, rape cases are often dismissed because of lack of evidence. That's probably the first time in history we're going to have such wide scale, not only of cases, but of evidence to prove it as well. That's completely changing the way we approach that sort of violence.
Definitely. And what is also interesting about DNA is that it doesn't grow old. Cases can be opened in 10 years, 50 years, maybe even 100 years. Maybe the victims might not be even alive when the case could be opened. And also, if you think about deported children and their DNA, it's possible that these crimes might not get justice as we speak or in a few years, but they might get justice in the future. But of course, the question is that when does the crime grow old? These are good questions. I think they're going to face a lot of interesting ethical questions and why it is important to keep the evidence and the data safe. It's also, again, a question of money and political will, but it's also one way of commemorating the victims as well.
You've talked about, and you talk about it at length in your book, how rape is a hallmark of the Russian military and has been for decades. One anecdote that's really striking is how a Lithuanian organization sent abortion and morning after pill just 2 weeks into the invasion before any of the reports had really come out, before we knew anything. And why is rape different than other tools in warfare?
Rape is not only targeted towards the victim, but the whole community. Rape is a crime that has a future tense in the form of children, obviously, but also it is targeted to break communities and families and therefore destroy the future of a community. And when we talk about war rape, then also those who are bearing witness are traumatized. Quite often these crimes are public. So it's traumatizing the whole community. You could also say that it's one form of biological colonization as well. Now, when we think about what's happening in Ukraine, then I think we should also call the sexual violence genocidal. And when we talk about genocide, what matters is the intent, not, for example, the number of crimes, but the intent itself. And there are witness testimonies saying that Russian soldiers, when they are raping, they might say, for example, we are going to rape you until you cannot have children. We are going to rape you until you don't want to have sex with Ukrainian men. And these kind of sentences are pretty clear evidence of the genocidal intent. And obviously, if they are castrating Ukrainian soldiers, then that's clearly, it has a genocidal intent as well.
And why does the Russian military rely on that so much historically?
One thing is that it is cheap. Sexual violence is the cheapest weapon you can have. You don't need an expensive education. It's cheap and it's effective. If you think about the consequences, it is extremely effective. But of course, some people might say that sexual violence has always been part of war, any war. But common responsibility is a key question here. For example, if you think about what happened in Germany, in Berlin after the Second World War, then it was the Red Army who did the majority of the sexual crimes. So if there's no common responsibility, then sexual violence against civilians is more likely to happen. And then if you think about Russian army, then the Russian army itself is using sexual violence as well. It's one way to bully young recruits, for example. Sexual violence is very common in prisons, and Russia is a country where the number of inmates is very high. Now, of course, all the majority of the inmates are fighting in Ukraine, but that means that Russia has sent to the front people who are used to sexual violence. They are used to committing sexual crimes, and if sexual violence is pretty much allowed and accepted by authorities in Russia, then how can you expect the soldiers to treat Ukrainian women better than they treat actually women of their own country? So in that way, Russia is a country where actually home front and the everyday life has created a fruitful soil to commit sexual crimes.
I just want to go back to when we talked about the idea of a good Russian woman and how that's embedded in the sexual violence narrative. There's a phrase you use in the book that I thought was really interesting, and I'd love for you to explain that to our listeners. It's what you call the Russian maternity package.
Yes, I'm quoting Russian researcher Ekaterina Schulman here. Russian maternity package is a variety of perks women get when men are sent to fight a war. Russian state hasn't ever paid so well for its citizens for dying and giving birth. The Russian soldiers, they are really getting paid well, but the families are paid well when the men simply die. The widow gets money, the children get money, the mother gets money, the children have the possibility to get easily to universities. The Russian family unit is a mother with children. Because in Russia, the divorce rates are very high, and men are not really interested in paying alimonies. So if you want to get money to support your children, then actually it is a very good solution that you make sure that a husband goes to war. And actually there have been quite many Russian women who have turned their husband to authorities just to make sure that they are recruited to the war because they haven't got the child support from the husband.
We've talked a little bit about justice, but from your research as well as from your personal family story, what do you think repair looks like for the people who have gone through rape and for a society that has gone through it at such a large scale?
There should be trials. And we shouldn't be waiting for the war to end to have trials about the war crimes, sexual crimes included. There is absolutely no need to wait for the end of the war. That is one thing. But at the same time, it is possible that all those who have committed war crimes are not going to get punished. That doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't have these cases opened. If we think about the future of women, children, and well, men as well, then how we are going to confront these crimes and what are we going to do with them is going to have effects on the future of women's rights globally. If these crimes go unpunished, then it is a very strong signal to not only dictators and authoritarian rulers of the world, it is a very strong signal to every single sexual criminal of the world.
I think what you've laid out for us in this conversation is also how there's a continuum. It starts with hate speech. It starts with talking about women in a dehumanizing, sexualizing way. It ends with rape. What starts as hate speech can end in genocide. Is that something you would agree with?
Definitely, yes. It starts always with words. And as an author, I do pay a lot of attention to the words. And that is one reason why the war didn't actually surprise me, because the hate was already in the Russian media. It was in the language. It was in the way, for example, Russia was targeting Baltic states, and it was the language of hate. We were not entitled to our sovereignty, and we were not actually entitled to being humans. If your neighbor is using this kind of language, then, and it goes unnoticed. It goes unnoticed and unpunished, and nobody intervenes, then it is just encouraging. It all starts with language.
Thank you, Sophie. Is there something else you'd like to add, something we haven't talked about that you think is important?
Actually, look, I guess the key question is that Russia is committing sexual crimes because it hasn't ever been punished for them. Russia's impunity is the key enabler of Russian war crimes.
Our second interview is with Tetiana Tymoshenko. She's a therapist who works with a UNFPA program called Aurora, which helps survivors of sexual violence in Ukraine. I wanted to ask her about what her work was like since the beginning of the invasion and how the war has changed attitudes towards sexual crimes in Ukraine. Here's our conversation.
Tetiana, what sort of trends, what sort of patterns have you seen? And can you give us a sense of scale of the number of people, because I know it affects men and women, that have been affected from where you sit?
Цифри я можу сказати тільки ті, які є офіційні, за даними Офісу Генерального.
I can only mention the official figures from the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. As of early November 2024, I found the total number of recorded cases related to the conflict to be 326. 209 women, 117 men, and 17 minors. In March, the figures changed, but I only saw the total number without breakdown by gender. 344 as of March 2025. But this is all just official statistics. According to UN estimates in the conflict zone, those numbers should be multiplied by 10 or even 20 compared to the registered cases.
Потрібно помножити на 10 або на 20 від зареєстрованих.
And Tetiana, can you please explain why there's such a difference between the official numbers from the prosecutor's office in Ukraine and the estimates from the UN?
Так, тому що люди не звертаються за допомогою.
Because people don't seek help. They don't seek help for a number of reasons. A lack of belief in justice, that the perpetrators will be found and punished. They try to suppress painful memories so as not to traumatize themselves or their loved ones. A lack or absence of resources to begin a long and exhausting fight for justice. Not recognizing themselves as survivors of CRSV due to lack of knowledge about its forms, fear around privacy and confidentiality, shame, guilt, societal cultural norms, fear of being blamed by others, because in reality, those who have experienced sexual violence often face condemnation and judgment. There's also the absence of reliable reporting channels that people can trust, because trust in others is very low. Condemnation from a partner or spouse, loss of authority in the eyes of one's child, fear of destroying family relationships, lack of legal knowledge, and situations where CRSV survivors have to receive services in the same space as the opposite sex, even if not at the same time. And again, concerns about privacy and confidentiality. Often people only disclose the violence when the physical consequences require urgent medical attention. For example, injured genitals, tears, physical injuries requiring urgent medical intervention, such as bleeding or severe trauma.
Особливо, які наділені владою. До лікарів і психологів може таке бути.
So the people that you see in your rehabilitation programs and that you see in therapy, can you give me a sense of whether it's more men or women? I imagine it's more women. And what has been the process? How have they managed to come to this space where they've been able to seek out resources? What's been the journey for them?
Платформа Аврора зроблена таким чином, що є сайт,
The Aurora platform is structured so that there's a website and a link where people can register. All available services are listed there and it's circulated. There's also a lot of advertising in survivor relief centres, medical clinics and even street ads. The person can follow the link, register anonymously, leave a contact, and the psychotherapist contacts them directly and arranges online sessions. The platform offers between 10 to 15 free sessions for survivors. The consequences of sexual violence are very serious. Survivors experience physical and psychological trauma, including injuries to the reproductive system, HIV/AIDS, other STIs, unwanted pregnancies, forced abortions, and other complications requiring long-term treatment. And based on data from all wars, girls and women suffer the most. What has also helped people seek help is not just advertising, but also the fact that everyone heard about what happened in Bucha, Izium, Kherson, and other deoccupied areas. It was talked about openly. There's also the NGO SEMA Ukraine, whose members openly speak about these crimes and encourage others to come forward. That was a turning point in showing that this isn't shameful, it's a war crime. So most who reached out were women, but there were also many men. Men who have experienced CRSV often remain silent because of stereotypes around masculinity. This leads to isolation, depression, PTSD, and increased suicide risk. They also face stigma and lack of professional help. A large number of male survivors of CRSV are civilian men, also from deoccupied territories. Fortunately, many of them are now uniting through civil society organisations because being together, being a community, is what gives them resources, strength, and they talk about what happened to them. And at the moment, the number of male survivors is very large. Men also reached out to Aurora, but statistically fewer than women, though not because they suffered less. CRSV causes psychological trauma not only to the survivors, but also their families. Family members experience deep stress, guilt, helplessness, and may not know how to support their loved one, leading to family conflict and social isolation. As for children who witness or suffer CRSV experience deep psychological trauma affecting their emotional, social development and future. It's a complex trauma because it involves multiple traumatic events: loss of loved ones, captivity, torture, forced migration. Rape trauma in war is also collective because the suffering is known and shared by the whole community. Also, people affected by CRSV often have fear and distrust, especially of authority figures, doctors and psychologists.
Особливо, які наділені владою. До лікарів і психологів може таке бути.
What does rehabilitation look like, and what are the people that she's seeking and looking for in the future in order to help? We've talked about the head prosecutor office. Do most people have cases opened, criminal cases? Is that something they're hoping will give them some closure, for example? What are they hoping from authorities and from therapists?
Ну, взагалі, ця групова програма, яку саме ми...
Our group program aims to help women and girls affected by CRSV stabilise, believe in themselves and their future, improve quality of life, and take action to rebuild their future, to reduce symptoms, regain control over their lives, to reduce PTSD and anxiety and depression symptoms, improve emotional regulation, learn to identify and neutralise triggers, master self-help tools, and gain skills for self-care and interaction with others. Also to build resilience, the ability to recover, because we talk so much about trauma, but not about post-traumatic growth, resilience.
Знаєте, ми все про погане, а про посттравматичний зріст якось ми не сказали, резилієнтність.
And what does that look like, post-traumatic resilience in people's lives? Does she have any examples of what that looks like for her patients, for example?
Ну, по-перше, спільнота, бо наша програма допомагає той спільноті сформуватися.
Well, first of all, community, because our program also helps that community to form. And the experience and example of others, the opinion of others. Sharing that experience, it's generated, it's adopted, it's supported by others. Because our program lasts 15 days, half a month, but it doesn't end there. Women continue receiving support from case managers on Aurora, as well as psychotherapy. They can also receive help from lawyers and psychiatrists if it's needed. First and foremost, it's the community itself, their survival skills that we strengthen, their resources, what helped them back then. And we continue to develop it, because in fact they have it. Many of them change, their value system changes entirely. They begin to speak publicly, help others, they become volunteers, their relationships become deeper.
Соціальні працівники, юристи і всі інші, які допомагають цим поратись. І так.
Just to go back to my question about your patient's relationship with legal cases, what are your patients' interests in getting a criminal case through? Is that something they're hoping for? And is your sense that that's something that we'll see happening a lot in Ukraine, a lot of criminal cases around sexual violence through the war. I know there are some cases already. Is that a change that your patients are looking forward to? Is that something they're looking for repair?
Учасниці саме нашої програми реабілітаційної.
Yes, all participants in our rehabilitation programme are those whose cases are officially documented and registered with the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. People who seek help through Aurora, yes, we also tell them about this opportunity. There's a lawyer who helps with document submission. The platform and the rehab programme itself don't handle this directly, though. I can't speak from a legal perspective, but in our programme, all cases are declared officially. And yes, people want to document what happened and see perpetrators punished when they're part of a community. They want occupiers held accountable. That's why survivor relief centres are important. They have specialists, social workers, lawyers to help.
І всі інші, які допомагають цим поратись. І так.
Tetiana, you mentioned the work of a lot of NGOs, especially since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in making the issue of sexual violence at the forefront of the conversation. Are you witnessing a change in Ukraine as a country and the society in terms of attitudes towards sexual violence because of what's happened in the war and because of the scale of everything?
Ну, точно обізнаність підвищена, точно.
Definitely increased awareness. Most Ukrainians now understand that this is a war crime. That helps people speak out. But all of them need support. That's why the majority of those people who talk about it are in certain communities. Because this approach, peer-to-peer, where survivors have similar experiences, it contributes to that support and mutual help, and definitely helps cooperation with other institutions. Psychological support, especially psychotherapeutic work, is crucial to process trauma. That allows people to make calm and balanced decisions. Social support and case management are also essential. I've said almost nothing about the programme, but I will say these important things. The programme is a joint initiative of UNFPA, NEMIA, Aurora, with the involvement of a survivor network and with government support. And it has strong, powerful results because we conducted research at the beginning, when women entered the programme, after its completion, and also interim results of the study. And they confirm its effectiveness and the reduction of those post-traumatic stress symptoms and improvements of their resilience and overall of their life, their quality of life. The programme is comprehensive and in accordance with international standards and takes into account the Ukrainian experience of providing support to CRSV survivors.
З урахуванням українського досвіду надання допомоги постраждалим від СНПК.
I was also curious if there's anything that has surprised you in the last few years of dealing with that scale of sexual violence.
Ті звірства, які чинять окупанти, бо коли дуже жорстокі...
The atrocities committed by the occupiers. Because when children and elderly women over 80 years old are brutally raped, the torture, the abuse... Well, it's impossible to convey, and every story is unique and has its own tragedy.
Історія унікальна і зі своєю трагедією.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and Francis Durnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced and edited by Rachel Porter and me, Adelie Pojzman-Pontay, with help from Lillian Fawcett and Antonia Langford. Executive producers are Frances Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.